Good day again, friends. Today, I want to talk to you about one aspect of racism in Canadian society that I believe really seems to get overlooked. And it has to do specifically with our First Nations and Indigenous communities. And it has to do directly with representation. And what I'm going to do is start off by just explaining how the ministries in charge of Indigenous affairs. Right now we have two ministers in Parliament that are dedicated to Indigenous affairs. One of them is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, and that is currently Carolyn Bennett, who is a white woman. And we have a second minister, which is the Minister of Indigenous Affairs, who is Mark Miller, a white man. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, again, it's going to be boring, but I'm going to read you a list of the ministers of Indigenous affairs throughout history. And I want you to see a trend. But first off, the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Indigenous Affairs wasn't always called that. In the beginning, just to give you an idea of how the position evolved, at least by the titles, it started off, we had a Superintendent General of Indian Affairs. And then that got put to the side, and we just had Minister of Interior and Mines that were responsible for Indian Affairs. And we had, after that, we had the Minister of Citizenship, who was responsible for Indian Affairs. And then you had the Minister of Indian Affairs and Northern Development. Then they changed the name of that to just Minister of Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development. And then they changed the name to Minister of Indigenous and Northern Affairs. And then that became the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations and Northern Affairs. And then that became the Minister of Crown and Indigenous Relations, currently occupied by Carolyn Bennett. And since 2017, we have had a position of the Minister of Indigenous Affairs. And since its inception, it has been occupied by, the first one was Jane Philpott, the second one was Seamus O'Regan, and our current one, as I mentioned before, is Mark Miller. And I found it funny, a couple weeks ago, I was watching on TV and watching Mark Miller, our white, red-haired Minister of Indigenous Affairs, talk about systemic racism in Canada. I just saw the irony in that. But now what I want to do, I'm going to read the list of every minister on the side of the Crown and Indigenous Relations, Carolyn Bennett's current job. I'm going to read you because that's been the ministry basically in charge of our Native community and Indigenous affairs historically since Confederation. I'm going to read the names of the people who occupied those seats right from the beginning. They are Sir Hector Louis Langevin, Joseph Howe, James Cox Aikens, Thomas Nicholson Gibbs, Sir Alexander Campbell, David Laird, David Mills, Thomas White, Sir John A. MacDonald, served twice, Edgar Dewdney, Thomas Maine Daly, Sir Hugh John MacDonald, Sir Richard William Scott, again, served twice. Sir Clifford Sifton, Sir Wilfrid Laurier, Frank Oliver, Robert Rogers, William James Rush, Arthur Meehan, Sir James Alexander Lougheed, Charles Stewart, Henry Herbert Stevens, R.B. Bennett, Charles Stewart, Ian Alistair Mackenzie, Thomas Giro Murphy, Thomas Alexander Currar, James Allison Glenn, James Angus McKinnon, Colin William George Gibson, Walter Edward Harris, Jack Pickersgill, Davy Fulton, Ellen Fairclough, the first woman minister, followed by Dick Bell. Love that name. You can hear him coming. Guy Favreau, Rene Tremblay, John Robert Nicholson, Jean Marchand, Arthur Lang, and here's where we start getting into names that people might recognize. Or more, the younger people might recognize, sorry. Jean Chrétien, Judd Buchanan, Warren Almond, James Hugh Faulkner, Jake Epp, John Monroe, Doug Frith, David Crombie, Bill McKnight, Pierre Cadieux, Tom Siddon, Pauline Brose, Ron Irwin, Jane Stewart, Bob Noe, Andy Mitchell, Andy Scott, Jim Prentice, Chuck Strahl, John Duncan, James Moore, Bernard Valcourt, and currently Carolyn Bennett. Did anyone see a trend there? The trend was, out of all those people that have occupied those two ministry seats, there has been one person of indigenous descent. One. And that was this guy here. Bob Noe. And not much is said about him on this page. But that has been that guy is our only indigenous person to have ever served as any type of minister of indigenous affairs. Now, I understand that some people might be saying, well, how many indigenous members of parliament have there been? There couldn't have been that many. Well, let's take a look at that. Right here on this page is a list of indigenous members of parliament throughout history. And complete with the dates and everything. This is from Wikipedia. Both these websites I'm showing you are both Wikipedia. And you take a look, and this is just people that have served in the House of Commons up here. And we see that there has been many, many opportunities throughout the history of Parliament that the government could have actually had an indigenous person responsible for indigenous affairs. But we've had one. One. There are currently 2 ministries that deal with it. And right now, we currently have 0 people that the ministry claims to represent are actually part of the ministry. And that in itself creates division when we have ministries dedicated to a certain population that are run by people that are outside of that population. And if we look through the history of the names I listed, also from Wikipedia, particularly in the earlier years, how often do we see that the person who was in charge of Indigenous affairs was also one of the people in the government who was most against the Indigenous people, who were pretty much pro-slaughter the Indigenous people. It doesn't work. And like I said, it's not because of choice. We have had several Indigenous people be deemed worthy enough to represent them via a democratic election. We have had several capable people occupy seats in the House of Commons that could have made very capable ministers of Indigenous affairs, of Northern affairs. At whatever point in time we were at, they would have made very capable ministers. One guy I really liked was this guy here, Romeo Saganash. Now, granted, he lost out in the last election, but he was fantastic MP. So was Bob Rusnak. And they didn't even get a look. Jody Wilson-Raybould never offered that position. Why? We need to ask that. And that's, like we say the residential schools were bad. Why did the residential schools take place? Because we had someone who was pro-eradication of native culture, of Indigenous culture, the one in charge of representing Indigenous affairs. That's how we got there. Our representation is off. And there are other areas in the government where our representation is off. Like if we look at moving away from Indigenous affairs, if we look at Wexit, or whatever you want to call it, that's because there's a lack of representation. The west of Canada is disproportionately represented in a lower way that provides the eastern Canada an improper balance of power. And that's just on a micro level. And we see how the Westerners are reacting now. Now, just imagine if that is what you've been faced since the beginning of Canada. This is one of the main reasons we have the division, is because even when the people have spoken and said that we want representation by electing people as their MPs, we are ignoring that call for representation. Very few times does your Indigenous member of Parliament become a minister. And that's wrong, especially when there is a ministry dedicated to their needs. It makes no sense. That has to change. And if it doesn't, it's only going to result in problems further on down the road. And we have the capacity to change it. It's just a matter of will. It's just a matter of doing what's right. In this case, it's just a matter of Mr. Trudeau making the right decision. If he gets voted out next term, so be it. I just hope that whoever is in charge come the next election, when it comes to appointing ministers, I hope it's done appropriately, because one thing is for certain, that whoever gets in, they are going to have an opportunity to do the right thing, because the people will be there. Right now, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 members of the Indigenous community in our parliament. 10 out of 338. We can pick one, even two, to fill the roles of Indigenous and Northern relations. We don't need Southerners who are not in any way knowledgeable about the cultural barriers dictating to our Indigenous people what they can and can't do, what access they can have. I guarantee you, if we had actual Indigenous people representing the Indigenous people as ministers of Indigenous affairs, I don't think we would have so many remote northern communities without hydroelectricity. I don't think we would have the problems we have with infrastructure in northern Ontario. I think we would have got roads built to some of those northern communities. I think we would have had proper sewage. I think we would have proper drinking water for these communities. But we don't, because we have consistently put people in place that are more than willing to look the other way because they are only looking in their own backyard and not about what is going on in the world around them. And since a lot of these remote communities are not right in the backyard of people from the cities, they just get ignored. And we cannot allow that to continue. And as I said, this is an easy thing to fix. All that is required is for our leader, whoever it may be, to make the right choice. This is literally as simple as changing your mind. We need to change our mind, and we need to make sure that equal rights get given to everybody in Canada. And we need to make sure that we allow democracy to take its course in Canada. We can start that now. Let's make the decision to do it. Thank you.